So this is year one after taking it out of crop rotation. It's been corn and soybean for about 40 plus years. Ended it on soybean last year with a harvest in October. I wanted them to go ahead and terminate after being in soybeans so that the soil was a little bit better off than being in corn with less stubble. It was broadcast spreaded in the winter by a mix by hand as well as by a push broadcaster. And so you see some pretty definitive lines, especially as we get a little bit further up. A little later on in the season, I went ahead and put in this game bird mix. This is one of the attempts at trying to produce a little bit more poultry and bird feed, as well as maybe bringing in wild quail or turkey back to the property. So this one's doing quite well. This was a later season planting, as I said. See a lot of sunflowers coming up as well. The rest of the planting in here is largely a mix of alfalfa, cereal oats. There's a bunch of other stuff. The oats have done really well. The alfalfa has done really well. The clover is doing exceptional. It is June 25th currently. We've had a very dry year. Not a lot of rain. We went 18 days without a rain, with it being in the 80s and 90s. You can see the clover. It's better in some areas than others. This area I'm in currently is going to be sort of the end of the fence row for the livestock paddock area. So it is not as densely planted because I didn't want to be planting stuff I was going to have to destroy for putting up fencing or other projects. These are the tree clusters I've started putting in for shade. We've got a huckleberry in there, tomato, Chinese chestnut. There's a pecan, a couple of trees that didn't take. Currently, there are 4 of those clusters. Sunflowers have done really well in a few areas. Sasquatch! You can see the clover's done much better up through here. The crimson clover is actually still blooming, which is really surprising, being as late as it is in the season and as hot as it is. Got another little tree cluster here. Went ahead and did a lot of cool season brassicas, some tillage radish, turnips, beets, all sorts of different things as a mix of forage and to try and break up the soil. I've had minimal weed pressure this year, and I attribute that primarily to the fact that there is so much herbicide left. I have been trimming back the horseweed and the ragweed as it comes up. Been trying to get it before it goes to seed. I just don't want it to get too crazy till I at least have a good coverage of what I want on the ground. Okay, into this area, there was no more seeding other than the clover seeding. So you can see the lines from where it broadcasted back in the winter. And this is back into the hand broadcast clover. And there's a few brassicas and whatnot through this area. They get a little bit denser as we get further up. You can see here's one still doing quite well for the weather. That's within another one of these tree clusters. This is actually 10 different trees all in one hole. We'll see what that does. There's a locust, cypress, poplar, oak, and cypress. Locust as well. Start to get into a little bit more ragweed in this area. Now most of this has been completely unmowed, untouched, other than the nipping of the weeds. I did come into an area that had a lot of ragweed and horseweed and went ahead and bush hogged it just to try and knock that down a little bit. before it did go to seed. None of it is quite there where it's at seed stage yet, so it's not been a big deal to get onto it. You can see up in this part of the field, did significantly less seeding, primarily just because I didn't know what is going to happen with this area yet, as we do intend to build a barn and a shop, most likely somewhere over in that area, as well as a arena and some horse pasture. So I didn't want to go too far out in terms of planting things that are going to get, again, destroyed when we're doing development or changing things up. It is still nice and green. There's a fair amount of different grasses that have come in. There was the clover that was broadcast spread in here as well, and it is still doing well. Radishes, most of them have gone to seed nicely, so hopefully that'll be a large part of next year's crop. Got some more dead areas here. This is kind of the norm for the spots that hadn't been done at all. There's some of this wood sorrel in here, and just a lot of thatch from previous years. You can still see the corn from 2 years ago when there was corn. And they did the corn harvest in September or October, if I recall. This was all flowers here. You can see they finally baked out in the sun. Got a wood chip pile sitting on somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 to 1,000 cubic yards of wood chips when they were dumped, and they've started to compact pretty well now. So I've been using them in the deep mulch garden. I've been using them around the tree clusters. I've been using them on this hedgerow that I've put in of honey locusts. There's 100 of them along the road frontage currently, with more going in, planting an additional 400 to 500 trees this fall. You can see really great growth. Now across the road there is still conventional corn and soybean. Into this area, we've had no grass seed put down. You can see it has filled in. I'm not sure what this grass is. I'm not very good at my grass identifications, but it is withheld in the areas. We've also had the blue stem that held up and was a good early spring cover over almost the entire lower portion of the field. The upper portion, not so much. You can see the winter wheat that came back in. It did quite well. I'm hoping to let it go to seed enough to maybe get some more next year. I'll probably go ahead and put some more into the mix as well for my pasture seeding this year, just to try and build some more diversity. And a large part of what I'm interested in that lower portion is being able to run birds through it and get a large amount of their grain off of the property. Yaddy, Sasquatch, come. Sasquatch. Now we're not at a point where we need to put livestock on. We do have a horse and a sheep that we rotate out in netting occasionally. The horse does have laminitis issues, so he can't be on grass full time. We do intend to have horses in the future that will be able to be, probably only 1 or 2. So for that kind of pasture and dry lot situation, we're looking more equine based. The lower portion is going to be livestock focused for meat production, chickens, potentially sheep. I wouldn't mind to get a cow or 2 on here. This area here, you can see a little bit of a road. That's mostly wood chips, and that's where I was moving another pile of chips out. It was fairly wet at the time, but I had to get them moved. So it's pretty much dead. It's fairly compacted. You see some more of our grasses coming in here. This stuff is actually pretty dense. I don't want to try and graze on anything until next year at the earliest for the most part, because I am hoping to get my stem density up, my roots up a little bit, and also just go ahead and let the ground have a little bit of rest. It has been conventionally farmed for long enough that it's pretty tired. But you can see there is coverage throughout. Again, this area has not been heavily seeded. Squash. Now we are sort of coastal Virginia. 7A is our zone. Our average rainfall is something around 48 or 52 inches a year. I don't recall exactly what it is. Like I said, this year's been pretty dry. Wasn't an overly cold winter, but it did stay cold late. Now this is an interesting area in that this is actually fill dirt. This was dug up from a neighbor that dug a pond. And you can see just how much happier the plants are that are grown in this than the stuff that's in the fields. The oats are double size, the radishes are just super vibrant, everything's got really nice color. So that is with no herbicide and some fertility, minimal, as most of that came from about 6 feet down. So there's some corn that's come up from previous planting. It's intermittent in areas. It actually looks pretty decent. Not close enough that I expect any sort of fertility out of it, but there's some greenery. Now we're getting back into the area that was seeded. There's a mix of different things out there. There's the majority of it is the cool season cover crop mix from Green Cover. I believe I did 50 pounds total on basically 1 3/4 of an acre or so. That whole area is a 2-acre swath, and I didn't plant nearly as heavily along that back stretch. You can see we've got poplars popping up in a few different areas. They've had a lot of growth. This one is most likely out of that very large poplar just back here behind the pine. There's also a cool season pollinator mix that was spread in here, just to try and get a little bit more diversity in bees in here. Coming into the clover pretty well in that spot here. As you can see, pretty good density. The alfalfa's actually done pretty nicely. Like I say, the oats have been by far the best. Here's a little sweet corn patch. Kind of gives you an idea of fertility, as there's not a whole lot here. I did spread a thin amount of compost into this area. There's one of the turnips. So this was an experiment with Sasquatch. Come. This was an experiment with extending the garden crop out, as well as getting some of the grains and stuff back into it. These are some cowpeas through here, pretty heavily spread just by hand. They're doing okay, not as well as I would like. This is an annual rye. This is when I was trying to dial in my just push broadcast spreader and had it super heavy density, so this was really nice grass coming up. I have let it go to seed. I'm trying to let everything go to seed. been tractoring 4 meat birds over it. They're not Cornish crosses, so they're not particularly big at this point, but you can see they've knocked it over pretty well. It's in the doe stage. I would like to put them somewhere else, but if there's anything that I'm going to lose, I want it to be the annual rye instead of the alfalfa and oats. I did run them over here in alfalfa and oats. 3 runs through that stretch. You can see it's starting to recover. It was fairly bare in this area, so they didn't take it down too far except a couple of these spots. Run the layers through it as well in a tractor situation. They've been sitting in the same spot for a little while. They've got it obviously very dead, so I'm gonna go ahead and most likely plant some more melons into that, or maybe some more squashes. Normally we roll them along and move them every day or every other day. Some fruit trees here. First one, you can see they're actually doing pretty darn well, especially for being in the field. This part has not done overly well. Is up here where you see this buffer. There was about a 4 to 6 foot strip next to it that didn't grow well. Same thing with here, and that even when you look at the older satellite footage of the property, you do see that. But for being planted into herbicide-ridden field, I'm actually quite happy with them. As you can see, I did do mulch over the top. There is compost top dressing and no compost in the hole. I get split back and forth as to whether I do that. There are hazelnuts in here, and this was the end of the field, as it basically was planted in a line about like that. So this is sort of your average untouched area here. I have mowed it once or twice because the morning glories have gotten really bad in spots. And then coming into this area, you can see there's a ton of fleabane, a lot of morning glory. I'm gonna go ahead and get in here and bush hog. This was a large brush pile before. I have burned it back. We have some grasses coming in nicely though. Believe those should primarily be things that sprouted themselves. I did put some annual rye down in this area, but that does not look like the annual rye. And a lot of it got disturbed anyways from when they brought in all this dirt and when they were doing the brush dumping and all that through this area. So total, it's a 10.5 acre field. Like I said, 2 acres, acre and 3/4, somewhere in that range, was pretty heavily planted. The rest of it is lightly planted and coming back naturally. Stem density is actually quite good in the areas that I broadcast spread with the push spreader. The rest of it is not so great. This is a small enough area that on my morning walks, I cut limbs off of the poplars and sweet gum and everything, and I just start dropping leaves into these areas. I will go ahead and do at least a light coating of compost in the spots that haven't been planted. I would love to try and get the entire area covered, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to find a manure spreader, and I don't know that I want to do it all by hand.